This video will focus on the Romanov Grand Duchesses and their love of photography using their Brownie cameras. I decided to make this video because I was educated in public school and the only form of extremism I ever learned about was fascism under the Nazis. I never learned about communism, I never learned about the Bolsheviks, and as a result, I wasn't educated on those topics at all. And so when I started looking into the Romanovs and the beauty of these princesses who were killed brutally by the Bolsheviks in 1918, it really gave me a perspective into the world we live in today. So the Kodak Brownie was one of the first affordable cameras produced. It was released in 1900 and it introduced the snapshot to the masses. It was a basic cardboard box camera covered by leather with a simple convex concave lens that took 2¼ inch square pictures on roll film. It was conceived and marketed for sales of Kodak roll films. It only cost $1 at the time, which is $33 in 2021 currency. And the Kodak roll film was also cheap, and so the Brownie camera became very, very popular. The name of the Brownie camera came from a popular children's cartoon at the time, and in Russia there was a cartoon Muppet show called Adventures of a Little Brownie. So I don't know if that's related to the Brownie name, but the Kodak Brownie camera was very popular and sold over 150,000 units in its first year. It was invented by George Eastman, and Eastman wanted to create an item where everybody had a camera. He wanted to make it completely accessible to the masses. And so when chemists had found a way to coat a glass plate with light-sensitive chemicals that would not lose their sensitivity when dry, Eastman was able to incorporate this into the Kodak Brownie by making the glass plates smaller. And so it was a great invention, and it was very popular all over the world. The Romanov sisters were able to take advantage of the Kodak Brownie because brownies were extensively marketed to children. Because of the affordability of the camera, this made it easy for children to receive them as presents, and the Brownie was also taken to war by soldiers. Nicholas II, the Emperor of Russia at the time, and the Romanov sisters' father, was a very dutiful soldier. And so his knowledge of the importance of geography on battlefields, how important it was to know the conditions in which you are fighting, made him a fan of the Brownie as well. And Kodak actually made him his own personal panoramic camera. As far as the Romanov sisters, they started out with Brownie number 2s and then escalated to Brownie number 3s, and the Brownie number 2 was more rectangular than the Brownie number 3, and the Brownie number 2 had a strap not on top of the camera but on the side. You will see photos of Grand Duchess Olga looking down at her Brownie 2 camera, and this is because she had to spin the camera to develop the lens, to develop the film, and so that's why she was looking down at it. She wasn't looking down at it because she could see the photo. She was looking down at it to make sure that the film was developed. The Brownie number 2 was made of aluminum cardboard, the leather covering, and the version she used was the non-color model, which cost only $275 at the time. The Grand Duchesses Romanov are often referred to by an acronym of their first names, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. Their brother, Prince Alexei, had hemophilia, and so while he does appear in many of the photographs, his mother was very careful with him. Unfortunately, due to the disease, when he experienced falls in his boyhood, he would bleed internally quite a lot, and he would have to lie down, and it would be very stressful for the entire family because he was the Romanov heir and because the public did not know of his hemophilia. And so the pictures that you will see include a lot of the Grand Duchesses, but know that other members of the family are in the background or are there too. Grand Duchess Olga was the oldest Romanov sibling, and she was born in 1895 in the summer palace, Tsarskoye Selo. I probably butchered that, sorry. She is my favorite Romanov sibling. To me, she was the bravest and the cleverest, and I also get chills when I look at her photos. So she was the most dutiful student out of all of the Romanov siblings. She loved to learn, and she loved to learn about politics. And I believe it was her that really brought the Brownie cameras into the Romanov household, because she was reading these magazines where there would have been Brownie advertisements, and she was interested in what was going on in the world. These are photos of her with, I believe, the Brownie 2. She took many, many photos throughout her childhood, and she got the entire family involved. Every single Romanov had a diary, and they would paste the photos into the diaries, and it was a hobby that they all got very much into. Even her father, the emperor, was fond of photography. And the Romanovs were living in Tsarskoye Selo, which is an imperial residence, the summer palace, outside the capital of St. Petersburg. And this venue afforded them a lot of freedom and a lot of space. And they actually set up their own photography studio on the grounds of that palace, and it would process 2,000 photos a year from 1905 to 1916, and many of the photos are lost, unfortunately, but you can see from this metric how popular photography was to the Russian royal family at the time. Part of what made photography an attractive hobby to the Romanov sisters was how they could do it in their own space. So Olga Romanov was expected to take care of her little brother, and she found this very difficult. In addition to that, Russian court was not her favorite place. Unfortunately, her mother, the Empress Alex, was not a favorite of the Russian court. She was viewed as too simple, too rural, and she was not very social, and her closeness to the priest Rasputin put a lot of people off. So the Russian court was not the friendliest place to Olga, who preferred playing the piano, drawing, painting, spending time with her horses, spending time outside. She loved taking walks with her father in nature. She loved reading. She loved going to church. And so all of these made her move towards photography as a hobby because it was a more introverted hobby and suit her better. The Grand Duchess Olga took her duties very seriously, and in 1914 she was tending to wounded soldiers from World War I on the grounds of Tsarskoye Selo. She would always have nursing training, and while she experienced a lot of serious sicknesses later in her life, especially after the Bolsheviks invaded the family space, she suffered from measles, for example, and pleurisy. She was always someone who wanted to help others. And because the Bolsheviks had such a strong hold on newspapers and the media in the 1910s, I think that Olga was gravitating towards photography and publishing photography maybe as a way to combat their influence. It's a shame that her photographs were never really published until after her death. Many of the photographs have never been found, but it is something that I think Olga was looking to influence the world around her, and this is one of her watercolors. Olga's younger sister, the Grand Duchess Tatiana, was the most favored at the Russian court. She was considered one with a mystical beauty, and she was quieter than Olga, more refined, and more extroverted, and this endeared her to the Russian court. Grand Duchess Tatiana also had a Brownie 2 camera, and the two oldest sisters, were known as the big pair. And so we see photographs of the girls together and how much time they spent together. They really were inseparable for their majority of their lives. Grand Duchess Tatiana was more domestic than Grand Duchess Olga, and she refused to be referred to by her title. And so she was called by a nickname, Tanechka or Tonka, and she took her role as sister very, very seriously. All of the sisters were raised very simply, and they slept on camp beds, which they would move around to each other's apartments. They bathed in cold water every morning. They knitted items for the poor. They were expected to help nurse during World War I. They visited churches very often, and if you look at photos of their bedrooms, you can see there are religious icons absolutely covering the walls. Grand Duchess Olga wore a pendant for St. Nicholas her entire life. And so the simplicity of their upbringing comes across in the photographs as well, because we see a lot of daily life. We see walking, we see swimming, we see going to the beach. Things that people would take photographs of today, the Grand Duchesses were taking photographs of 100 years ago. Grand Duchess Maria was the next oldest, and she was believed to have the sweetest temperament. Her beauty was remarked on and actually remembered by members of the British nobility long after she had been killed. She was so sweet, she called her younger brother baby and doted on him, and her governesses loved her. It's actually partly due to the governess's love for her that Rasputin was sort of frozen out by the family. Nursery governesses were very concerned about the attentions Rasputin was paying to Maria when she was just 9 years old. He would call her my dear Pearl M. He would ask her to do things like talk to him about the sea, nature. He would send her telegrams, and it's something that her governesses thought was inappropriate, and it certainly didn't help endear the Russian family, the Russian imperial family, to the Russian people who were suspicious of Rasputin. He had a very dark past, and the accusations on how he treated staff in the Alexander Palace were shocking. Everything from rape to orgies. It's thought, there was a rumor that he seduced the 4 Grand Duchesses. I don't think this happened. Reading Prince Felix Yusupov's autobiography, it's clear that while Rasputin was inappropriate, he knew not to mess with the Grand Duchesses, and he was also kept out of the family as the Grand Duchesses got older and shielded from them. And so I believe that the Grand Duchesses were kept safe from Rasputin. Grand Duchess Maria had her own Brownie camera, and she, along with her younger sister, Grand Duchess Anastasia, were known as the Little Pair. The sisters would spend time apart, the big pair and the little pair, with Prince Alexei loving to run to Olga's apartments whenever he got yelled at. Olga was his favorite. The younger sisters were not expected to participate in nursing like the big pair, but they did have an artistic flair. Grand Duchess Maria was left-handed, and she loved to paint and watercolor the photographs. And so we learn a lot about fabric, interior design, costuming of the Russian imperial family, because Grand Duchesses Maria and Anastasia spent so much time painting and coloring in these photos. Grand Duchess Anastasia was Maria's younger sister, and she was the clown of the family. She was very funny. In photographs, you can see her making faces. She would trip her older sisters. She always wanted to play. The younger sisters were shielded from a lot of the violence that was going around Russia at the time. For example, in 1911, the third Prime Minister of Russia, Stolypin, was assassinated at the Kiev Opera House, and Olga and Tatiana were in attendance and so saw this happen. After this, Olga asked her father for a gun, and she would carry it in her boot. I think it was one of the World War I Russian army guns that were distributed due to Emperor Nicholas II's close connections with the military and his role as head of the military. I think he could have gotten her a gun like that very easily. We don't know what happened with this gun. We know that the guns were confiscated by the Bolsheviks when the Romanov family was imprisoned in Alexander Palace. Prince Alexei had a toy rifle, and that was confiscated. And so I don't know if Olga was able to bring her little gun with her to Siberia when the family was exiled there. But it just shows that these girls were trying to save their family, and they were involved in the chaos at the time. There are a lot of interior photos because the Grand Duchesses spent a lot of time inside being tutored and also spending time with their mother, who was frequently ill. Unfortunately, Empress Alex had a heart condition, and she, in later life, had to use a wheelchair. Many photos show her sitting down or lying down, and so the sisters were aware of this and spent time with their mother indoors, sewing or knitting or embroidering items for charity. The Tsar's residence of Tsarskoye Selo is quite magnificent. The Alexander Palace was built from 1792 onwards, and it's where Grand Duchess Olga was born and where the Grand Duchesses spent a lot of their life. There was a royal forestry school founded there in 1803, and then later it moved to St. Petersburg, and so the estate was always very concerned with the natural world. It contained an artificial lake big enough for small sailboats, a Turkish bath, a red and gold Chinese pagoda crowned an artificial hill. There are two palaces in the Imperial Park, Alexander Palace, which is shown here, and then Catherine Palace. And Catherine Palace was built for Catherine the Great, and that's how Tsarskoye Selo started. It was an estate for her. The neighborhood, which is outside of St. Petersburg, also has really enchanting little things. Like, this house was built for the Romanov children, and it's a little playhouse, and you can access it by boat, and there are many photos of them in and around this house and also swimming in this water, including photos of their brother Alexei, despite his hemophilia, swimming here. When the Romanovs were imprisoned here at Tsarskoye Selo until August 1917, it wasn't the worst place for them to be under house arrest. They still had their cameras, they were still taking photos, and they were still permitted to exercise somewhat close to the palace, so it remained a place of happy memories for them. The Romanov family was headed by Empress Alex, who was originally Alex of Hesse, and she came from a lower noble German family who lived very simply, and were very closely connected with nature, a lot of hunting, horseback riding, that kind of thing. So her attitude towards her daughters was one of simplicity. She didn't allow the girls to wear a lot of jewelry. There wasn't a lot of finery in the palace. When Duchess Olga requested to use the finest carriage, it was denied her. And so this emphasis on simplicity and the religious life was very important to Empress Alex. Unfortunately, this attitude did not endear her to the Russian nobility, who expected a lot of pomp and circumstance, and they wanted to see all of Russian opulence on display sometimes. And I don't know if I entirely blame them. It was a very wealthy country in terms of resources, and still is, and the Russian nobility were very proud of this and wanted to see some of its royal successes on display. Regardless, Empress Alex was a fan of photography. She took photos with Queen Victoria. She ordered photo equipment from Great Britain and paid for professional photography services, which made up a significant part of the royal family's expenditures. So in addition to the amateur photography the Romanovs were taking part in, there was also professional photography. And the Romanovs would look over these photos, comment on them, write captions on them, color them in, and make them a part of their family time, which they took together every evening. We find a lot of the photos pasted in their journals today. The photos also show parts of, the Grand Duchess's lives that haven't entirely been explored. For example, the big pair shown here were fond of horseback riding, but they also had military duties. And so both of the older Grand Duchesses were associated with certain regiments, and they had duties with those regiments, which included training and shooting and being ready to march and being able to march and being shown in parades. So here we see Grand Duchess Olga in her 3rd Hussars Elisavetgrad regiment. And it's really remarkable, and I could not find any evidence that this regiment was given guns during World War I. So I don't know if Grand Duchess Olga would have been able to use her gun in exercises. It's just not clear. But it shows that the photography of the Romanovs was important for us to understand this period of their lives and the period that the Bolsheviks ruined. The sisters had their cameras with them during their imprisonment at Tsarskoye Selo in 1917, and also when they were separated in April 1918. In April 1918, the Bolsheviks moved the Emperor, and Grand Duchess Maria to Ekaterinburg. They didn't know what to do with the Romanovs because the White Army was approaching and retreating, and it was important that the Romanovs either be held by the Bolsheviks as a bargaining chip or be freed by the White Army. And so Alexei and the 3 other young women remained behind in Tobolsk, Siberia, because Alexei had suffered another attack of hemophilia. It was during this time that Olga, I think, may have been trying to get into contact with the White Army. She knew how to send telegrams. She knew how to send letters. There's reports when in their final house arrest that they were sending notes to the outside in milk bottles. They would write them in and stick them in. And so I think that Olga might have stayed behind to try to get free. But all of the Grand Duchesses were sewing jewels into their clothing in the hopes of hiding them from the Bolsheviks. And they did this, and when they were shot and then ultimately bayoneted in 1918, the Bolsheviks were shocked that they didn't die right away. And that's partly because they had sewn diamonds and sapphires and all of these wonderful jewels into their clothing. Olga was eventually reunited with her family at Ekaterinburg, and she was required to do, laundry, and they learned how to make bread, and in these photographs, you can see how thin they all have gotten. So they lost an incredible amount of weight. They weren't eating very well. They were so stressed out. They had lost a lot of their clothing. They only wore long black skirts and white silk blouses. Their short hair was tumbled and disorderly. They loved being outside, and so you can see on their faces that they're very pale and they miss being outside, and they were only allowed a few minutes of the day to go walk around the garden while under the watch of armed guard. And so these photographs are just incredibly sad. And so in May 1918, we have the last known photo of Olga and Alexei, and this is when they were aboard the Rus, which was a ship that ferried them to their deaths at Ekaterinburg.